Hi, I'm Joe Tolles. Growing up in the foster care system, working within it, and single-handedly raising 8 teens adopted from the foster care system has given me a unique view into that world. My reputation for working to keep children connected, healthy, and happy with families who love them is important to me. Who I am today is a far cry from what my circumstances might have dictated. To start, I had to navigate my own childhood hurdles to become the athlete, father, and therapist I am today. Together with child advocate specialist Renee Damon and our guest, I will highlight the issues that impacted me on my journey, issues that are most likely impacting children and families today. Join us as we examine my first steps out of the starting blocks and into the race. Chapter 2, Echoes of the Falls. For me, this story begins with the death of my maternal grandfather. He was a movie projectionist living in Niagara Falls when it was known as the movie capital of the world. As the story goes, he got trapped in the projection room when the film caught fire. As his life flickered out in the flames, the embers of our family's stability were also extinguished. His absence left a void that would echo through generations, leaving his family grappling with the consequences of loss, grief, and the unpredictable turns of fate. Little did I ever think about, however, that echoes travel in all directions, through the past, present, and future. For as long as I can remember, I have been on a quest to find where I belong, a search driven by a need to piece together the fragments of my identity. A search that began because I had none. Placed in foster care at birth, I grew up with a profound sense of disconnection, feeling as though I was floating untethered in a world where everyone else seemed to know where they came from. Over the years, these needs to understand my origins became more than just curiosity. It became a mission, an obsession, an essential step toward forming a healthy and stable identity. The journey to uncover my roots was anything but easy. It was exhausting, at times frustrating, but also filled with moments of excitement and even exhilaration. Each discovery was a small victory, a step closer to understanding not just where I came from, but who I am. But as I delved deeper into the history of my biological family, I began to uncover a pattern, one that spoke of a legacy of loss that has echoed through generations. On my mother's maternal side, this chapter of loss was shared with my grandmother. She married a man who would become my grandfather, a man who died tragically young at the age of 36. His death left my grandmother a widow at just 29, with 2 young children, my birth mother, who was 7, and my uncle, who was 4, and another child, my aunt, who had not yet arrived but was on the way. My grandmother, forced to carry on without her partner, must have felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. But her experience with loss didn't begin there. When she was just 10 years old, she lost her father, a loss that I imagine set the tone for the rest of her life. The grief must have been too much for her mother, my great-grandmother, to bear. Within a few years, she was institutionalized, unable to cope with the overwhelming sorrow. She spent the remainder of her long life in that institution, a tragic end for a woman who had already lost so much, and for children who had now lost both parents. My great-grandfather, the man who left such a void in my grandmother's life, had his own story of struggle. He immigrated to the United States from Lithuania when he was just 17 years old, likely making the journey alone. The records I found suggest that he never became proficient in English, even at the time of his death, and the challenges of life in a foreign land must have been immense. He spent 38 years working in the Pennsylvania coal mines, a life of hardship and toil, before passing away and leaving behind his wife and their 5 children. As for my great-grandmother, her story is equally poignant. She was married at the age of 16, a young bride, also born in Lithuania, facing a future that would be marked by profound loss. She had 5 children, but records indicate that she lost 4 additional children after their birth and had 6 stillborn children before she was able to have a successful birth. There is no information at all on her parents or any other family members. The loss of my mother's paternal side of the family was no less striking. My mother's father, my grandfather, who died at 36, came from a lineage steeped in sorrow. His parents married young. My paternal great-grandfather was just 19, and my paternal great-grandmother only 15. Their marriage, which lasted 7 years, ended in divorce at a time when divorce was almost unheard of. The issues of stigma, failure, and religious judgment must have been strong. When my great-grandmother left her husband, she left behind her children as well, abandoning them to a life without her. My great-grandfather's history is one of some mystery. His biological father, a soldier, doesn't appear to have been part of his life, and he was born the same year that his mother filed for a military pension for his deceased father. It is clear that he was adopted by his mother's second husband. My grandfather was only 9 years old when his mother left him and his brother behind. Not long after, my grandfather disappeared from the census records, never to appear again connected to either his parents or his brother. As for my great-grandmother, she remarried and had several more children, but the records do not indicate that she ever reconnected with the children she had left behind. As with everyone else, her own childhood was marked by loss as well. Her father died when she was just 13 years old, leaving her to navigate the world without his guidance. It took years, long past my own childhood, before I could piece together these stories, before I could look at the information objectively and see the tremendous loss that is the inheritance of my maternal family. Each revelation was like a puzzle piece falling into place, creating a picture that was as heartbreaking as it was enlightening. The one certainty is this history, good, bad, or indifferent, was mine, and in that ownership, there was a space for me. This legacy of loss doesn't make the pain of my own experiences any easier to bear, but it does give me a place in history, a connection to a past that is both tragic and profound. I've come to realize that the apple, as they say, doesn't fall far from the tree, and though my life has been marked by a sense of being uprooted, I now see that I am deeply connected to the tree that bore me, a tree with deep roots in the soil of loss, but also in the soil of survival. My life, marked by a sense of disconnection and loss, is a continuation of a story that began long before I was born. But there is something else in this story, something beyond sorrow, a resilience, a strength that has carried my family through generations of hardship, a strength that would prove valuable to me as I navigated the events of my childhood. It's a sad tradition, yes, but it's also a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. In knowing this, I find a strange comfort, a sense of belonging to a family I never knew, yet whose struggles and strengths have shaped me in ways I am only beginning to understand. The tragedy of my grandfather's demise set in motion a series of events that would weave through the fabric of my own story. The fracture in this family, unexpected and untimely, left us to fend for ourselves in the unforgiving currents of life, creating a cycle of brokenness that would become an integral part of our lifetime. Our guests for this episode are Martha Hornthal, adoptive mom and adoption competent therapist, and Danielle Skelly, adoptive foster mom and family advocate.
I have had the pleasure of hearing this story prior to Danielle and Martha. And each time that I hear it, I get different pieces that I just find so incredibly impactful. And I'm really curious as to see what Martha and Danielle felt while listening to that and hearing that before I put in my 2 cents and my input.
I think probably what struck me, the first thing that really that I kind of hung on through the whole reading was this generational loss, right? And this lack of a biological mom. And not a lack of it, but her lack of existence in these children's lives and how it goes back generations. And that I'm kind of struggling with words right now because that's really where I'm stuck is this idea of you weren't the first.
It was
And
very interesting, Daniel, because, I've spent a lifetime squirreling away information, bits and pieces. And in preparation for this, I had to sort of lay it out and sort of condense it so that it could make sense in the few minutes that I had to to present it. And the one thing, I mean, it made me extremely, extremely sad because the real underlying question is like, why me? Every adult, every adult lost their parent. Everyone.
Mm,
And so I wonder how that desensitizes a family to that type of loss. And so my feeling is those things that I imagine are part of the sort of a biological connection, the holding on to the people that you love might be damaged and missing. And it doesn't matter, right? Because you just move on. It just is incredibly sad to me. Not, and it's not, and this time in reading all this, it's not sad for me. I feel so sad for them that,
mm,
you know, we're all broken. We're all broken. Generations on both sides of my mother's side of the family. It's
yeah.
just amazing to me that I hadn't seen that before. I was so busy concentrating on my loss and my feelings. And then I got to see, of course,
I think I also the thing that struck me was this idea that I think you said your grandmother was institutionalized
my great grandmother.
and then your great grandmother and then talk about all the people and you talk about all the loss and then you get to yourself and then that word resilience comes up and I think part of resilience is the community that we have around us who understands the losses that are happening and it feels to me like we have more capacity today than we did when your family when all of this loss was happening again and again in these generations ago and that resilience was really different back in that time than it looks today. Like today resilience looks like I need to look back and I need to figure out what happened to everybody and how is this impacting me and this sense of like you said, just this idea that so much loss and that everybody has struggled, and maybe something about connection has been broken through that experience again and again and again and again.
What you don't have access to is sort of the details. So my great
Mhm.
grandmother, who was institutionalized after all of those losses, like the four children that died after birth and the six stillbirths, and then her husband, right? I
Yeah.
just like I really connected with that story in her. Her children were either instructed or decided amongst themselves that they would never share her existence with their children. And so the next generation thought that she had died, when in fact she died when she was 72 years old in that institution. I mean, obviously, if you I think if you have a heart, you have to feel for her. I don't know why that decision was made. I do know that it was a different time. Secrets were the big thing. She died without knowing her grandchildren, without seeing her children. Her grandchildren did not know that she was even alive. Part that's, I guess, important is because I really have spent a lifetime wanting to understand why, where, how, all of those things. And I was not able to get any of that information until I was in my adulthood. I'm a different person and I process it differently. I'm not so certain how I would have processed this information when I was a child. One of the things, I tell folks is that don't disconnect the kids from their curiosities. Try and help them. But man, this is hard for me as an adult. Given that I'm thinking differently than I was a child, I just don't know if that would have been helpful or not. I certainly feel as an adult connected to that. And the next episode we'll talk about my biological father's side. And there were decisions that I made about coming in to be a part of and rescue that were very unrealistic. And I was not a child, I was in my early 20s. And so I don't know if what you guys feel about sharing information, giving information, important, not important.
That word resilience, Martha, that you said, are you able to be the person that you are because your family has developed this resilience through whatever method at the time, whether it was completely alienating the grandmother who was in an institution, but they've made calculated decisions as a family structure to remain sustainable, right? On some level, to continue on. Whether those decisions were good or bad, or right or wrong, or healthy or maladaptive or whatever, you came to a place where you are as a direct result of the way they managed each of those losses. And your resilience and who you are was formulated by generations of choices and things that happened to them to get
Well,
you here.
it's
And
really, I'm
that's
sorry.
what strikes me, is how closely resilience and trauma, they lay in bed together, right? Is that you only have the resilience, or this word resilience, that you have because of this immense generational trauma. And
Well,
one couldn't exist without the other.
Well, and then we go back to the old question, nature or nurture. As an adult, I choose to believe that it's nature, that I was able to tap into some of their strengths or their abilities. But of course, that's a conversation that could take a lifetime. Because I didn't get any of the strength-based behaviors from the family that I was growing up in.
So the thing that I just wanted to also that strikes me is that process, almost secrecy and that kind of thing that people are choosing to do reminds me of what our brain does as a coping mechanism to allow us to move through something that feels really unsafe. It strikes me that this thing that individually happens, you're talking about it, and Danielle, you've observed it all the way across the spectrum of lots and lots of brain. So it's this thing that happens in a small level and then on this larger level as well. And it just kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It is mind blowing. And as I was listening and I was writing down the words of patterns, loss, generational, stigma, the puzzle pieces and being deeply connected to those roots that you were talking about, Joe, and then being in a place in your adulthood where you can look at it and dissect it and just find all of the moving pieces and put them all together. And as a child in the foster care system, with all that generational stuff and the trauma, and how often I saw that as a strength in the youth that I was working with, in the big picture of all this dysfunction that's going on and all the secrets that are going on, there was a piece that did strengthen that resilience and strengthen that need to find out where I came from and where I fit in this world. But again, I think so many children in the foster care system today get so much information that is either misdelivered or incorrect, or and just trying to figure out where they fit in all of that, and how tough that is as a child to be able to process it and understand it. You said the other words of different stigma and the human spirit, and when we see these children going through all of this, just as you did, how confusing and how just lost they must be trying to figure out where their spot is in the world, and wondering and asking those questions of why. Why was the secret kept? Why weren't we told? Why didn't we know? Is just such a big platform of just all of these questions to answer the past, present, and what my future is going to look like.
What you're making me think about also is that where was the switch? At what point in my life was there a switch where the information was not negative, right? Because now
Mm,
now
Mm.
talking about this, I'm really looking at the positive side of this. And I know that as a child, the information that I got would probably all fall on the negative side of the spectrum, that it wasn't good to know that any of it, like it didn't matter. If there was something wrong or bad about it all. And I have developed into this person that says, always going to be where I'm supposed to be. I'm always going to be on time, despite what I want to do. And that eliminates the qualifying good, bad. And as long as I look at information without those judgments, I often ask myself, what am I supposed to be learning here? Right?
mhm.
Why
Right.
is not why this is happening to me as when I was younger, the why me. Oh, it's like nobody else is doing this. I'm so alone. Nobody else understands, has turned into, okay, hit me. Let me figure out what I can take from this situation.
Before you said that, but it just reinforces what I was thinking. Like, why not do we share this with our children, right? As an adoptive mom, like, when do I, should I? And then I'm thinking about you, and I'm thinking, like, I don't know if the shift was in you or if it was in your community, right? Because, like, part of it is when you were in your foster home as a child, did you have this network of people that were going to sustain you and support you through getting this information, good, bad, or indifferent? Or was it because in your adulthood, you've been very intentional about surrounding yourself with people who are open and supportive and caring and created this family setting? So, was it less the age and more the support and circumstance and community you had around you? Because could you have had the capacity as a child to start thinking about some of these things if you had someone to, or some people, or a context, or a community to process it with?
Wow. If it was community, and I understand everything you said, and I agree with it. Look what we're missing. Look at
Hmm.
the opportunities we're missing to help kids. So I didn't think of it that way, but now that you say it, of course, that
Yeah.
has a huge piece to it. And if we don't provide our kids with that community, I guess, I tried to do that when I ran the camp. Like, the camp was only for kids who had been in foster care, only a week long, but I'm still hearing from kids who went there and thought it was like the best week of their lives because it was a community for them.
Yeah, and how we really don't allow for these communities to develop for kids in foster care by the nature of how often we move them, by how the nature of how quickly we unplug them from anyone that they could potentially have a connection with, by design of, like, oh, the caseworker got a different job, or they're in a different unit, or they're here or there, not even with an intention to disconnect them from a community, but it's a system that's raising children that's just not conducive of creating a community. It's not set up to create a community for these kids. And is that, I don't want to say is that what's missing, but on some level, it really hasn't doesn't have to do with the kids' capacity to deal with it, but the fact that we're not creating an environment for them to deal with it.
Well, and I know that for my own experience with my kids, the system really didn't like how much I wanted to knit everything together as often as possible. The system was like, you do too much, these kids are in care, they should be used to this. And I just kept thinking, I don't think they should get used to it at all.
Mm.
And in fact, that sounds like a terrible idea. So, yeah, I mean, it's again, it's that idea of like individually, it can be really disconnecting. And then the system comes in and decides what is going to be best, and it turns out that it is not for the best.
When you were talking, Martha, I immediately thought of my great grandmother
Yeah, me too.
losing all of those kids. She should have just gotten used to it, and it's not fair. It's like
No.
we shouldn't have to get used to
Mhm.
loss and trauma. And
Yeah.
I'm trying not to be emotional here, and I'm a crier, so if I cry, it's not a bad crying. It's
Mhm.
releasing everything that I've been holding on to for 65 years, and pieces of it come out are profoundly sad. And in this case, it's not even sadness for me. That statement, Martha, they should be used to get used to it. They should be conditioned to deal with this. This is their destiny. We recently had somebody in a public arena use the term, it's a fact of life. That's not acceptable. It's not
Yeah.
acceptable. That is not what childhood should be about. That's not what identity formation should be about. But where's the compassion? And it is a starting place, Danielle. It's a foundational starting place that you can fix you can fix that right there,
Yeah.
and it doesn't move, and you build off of that. But how do you do that is really the bigger issue.
Right. I mean that's the question, right? And being a foster adoptive parent and having, kids that were temporary and kids that stayed and connected and all these sort of things, like sometimes it was like so simple. Like when they came to our house and their behavior shift, it was really just so simple of just like I hate to say, like, just do the right thing. Like treat them like a 12-year-old, treat them like a 14-year-old, treat them like you would want your 14-year-old to be like. There's no like, but they're in foster care, or but they've done this or they've done that, or their behavior, or no, but they're just they're 14 or they're 12 or they're 2 or they're whatever. And to explain away our lack of humanity on some level, because there's just a humane right way to treat people, and somehow in foster care that's gotten really muddy and humanity doesn't fit in it somewhere.
And parenting is
Really.
difficult, especially when it's not they're not, your children, right? So there's a line that I keep for myself, and I always ask myself when it's the most difficult, and I say, be the parent that you needed.
Yeah.
In that time, in that space, when I'm most stressed, what would you have needed in that moment? I didn't have a basis or a real foundation for that, so it's always a question of bringing it back to being conscious of treating people like they should be treated.
I'm gonna have to write that on the back of my hand right now with my 12-year-old, because it is a really, just that moment of like, and I think that compassion can be really frightening for people, because if you're going to have compassion, that means you've got to move through that place of judgment, which gives you that nice little distance.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to then go through also that place of empathy where you might go too deep and then start thinking about your own trauma or whatever it is, that and you have to go through that as well to get to the place where you take those two things and you balance them, and then you have this compassion which allows you to have the feel and the discernment to make choices that are connected. They don't teach us that
Right.
even in therapy school. They teach you to have all this distance and can't do it that way and really
Yeah.
do work.
I want to add to that list that you said is, and it's also dealing with your own identity formation. Who am I? And because I am this person, this is what I should be do. So a lot of things like power, control come with those titles. And so you have to step aside from who you think you are. Because that's I mean, it sounds funny, but I've had to say to myself, I have absolutely no control in this situation. I don't care that I'm a teacher, that I'm a parent. I don't have control. And so there is that inclination to fight because you have this title, or this is who I think I am, that you must bend the knee to me because this is who I am. Right. And it's hard and vulnerable to step away from that identity.
That's the exact word that kept playing through my head, was this idea of vulnerability, right? Because you're right. In social work school and counseling classes, like No, don't show your vulnerable side. Don't cry when you're, don't have mirror neurons. Don't have any of those things. Be a robot. Don't have facial expressions, all those crazy things. And really, this idea of having compassion and being open and moving through that empathy is like, I have to be vulnerable that I'm a human being and that I have feelings and that your feelings might impact my feelings. It's clearly unhealthy because that's exactly what we're talking about is that a bunch of professionals who have said, "Oh, I'm not going to connect here. I'm not going to be engaged here." They should just understand that there's your boundary. There's your lack of vulnerability. There's your lack of compassion. Then creates a system where a kid can't hear his truth because he doesn't have people around him that are willing to sit with that uncomfortableness.
And I keep thinking about your great grandma. I cannot get her out of my head, Joe. I can't.
You know what? I fell in love with her. I just can't even imagine to have all of that happen and then everybody abandon you. How does that happen? How do you do that to somebody? Where is the humanity in that? I hope that the feelings that I have this moment and today about her in some way, shape, or form, she can receive it. I'm trying pushing it through to her, and I just hope that she can receive it. I just don't know how. We had a whole society that didn't talk about, don't you tell anybody anything you just don't talk about it. You just move on, put some dirt on it, and let's go. Obviously, we were born of different generations, and it's an exclusion of your feelings and your emotions. And that's who I am. Like, I am an emotional, sensitive person. I'm empathic. I can't even imagine navigating through life with all of those things that are so important to me turned off. To your point, Danielle, I think the system is turning off those buttons intentionally in the kids that we're charged to care for. Don't think, don't feel, don't. You'll get over it. Like, it's like that's not a
Right.
message.
And if you're too angry or you're too sad or you're too something, well, we have a pill to fix that, right? Because
Mhm.
it's instantly you're mentally ill. Instantly your anger, your grief, your frustration, your sadness, because it makes me uncomfortable because I don't know how to help you through it. I need you to stop that by any means necessary. But if you think about it in context of your losses, so if you were like super pissed off and beating the crap out of people at 15, I mean, you have countless generations of reasons why you should have done that. You should have been beating the crap out of people for your great grandmother, right? For her losses. I mean, in all honesty, the anger was generational, and how you chose to deal with it was completely up to you for the situation that you ended up how you ended up. But somebody would have shut those off for you, right? Nope, you're not allowed to be angry. Nope, you're not allowed to be sad. You're too sad. You're too angry. But we don't take into account that history. I think about my two littles who are 11 and 16, and they are both multi generations product of the foster care system, great grandparents raised in foster care. So like when my 11-year-old is, sprinting from a trauma response at school, it makes perfect sense to me because that was embedded from her grandmother, which is embedded from her grandmother, like because of the generations of fear that she carries in her soul.
I'm getting angry now.
I know. I
Hmm.
was
be-
just
Sorry.
thinking the same thing, Joe. As I was sitting here listening to everybody talk, I was just getting so angry. And the one thing that came to my mind is because I spent so many years working as a trauma therapist in the residential setting, and the cottage that I worked at, they labeled it the worst of the worst. And youth heard that so much going along with that, and they weren't allowed to feel, think, this, that. And and I think about we've talked about this before. You can have years of college and read all the books you want to read and everything, but when you're sitting in front of a child who has all this generational crap and trauma and chaos and stigma that's attached to it and not responding to that in a way, you can be damn straight. The kids that I worked with knew that I was human, knew that I had emotions, knew that I had feelings, knew that I could hear them, see them, wanted to listen to them, and they didn't know what to do with that because, again, for so long, don't speak about this, don't talk about that. And even in those residential settings, you go outside of that box of having that emotion or getting upset or swinging or swearing or went into a trauma response to something, you were punished. You lost privileges. You got sent to your room. You went to timeout. You went. So all of it's so conditioned, and it would make me so angry. And I worked so hard with staff to say that this is a human little person that has all of these emotions and all of these things, and do not shut that down and allow that to come out. We're here to support them and understand them and to give them that acceptance that it's okay to feel these things. But it's such a broken system that it's just not allowed straight across the board. I get so frustrated with all of the stigma and the lack of humanity and the lack of compassion and understanding for so many youth that are in the system today. And we can sit here as a group and understand what it means and that they need community and they need that one person. And I say it all the time, Joe. Sometimes it just takes that one person to look at them and say, what happened to you? Not, how are you feeling today on your 30th day in residential where everything is written on the wall of when you're going to eat, speak, do this and this and that.
All of those things are just making me reflect on the buttons I turned off. I had to, for survival. I had to, or face the wrath of the world. And so maybe that's also a gift from my ancestors. To be able to survive this, you need to shut that off, and that's such a sad thing.
And I think that at some point we get to a place where we can look at the buttons that we've shut off. And this is where, to me, there's this idea of maybe I don't need that button shut off anymore. Maybe there's another way. I might be surrounded by enough people. I might have enough resources, both internally and externally, that I can look at these buttons and really make choices about them.
So I think there's also some buttons that you can't turn back on, no matter how much I want to. Really talking about memories.
Do you mean because they're pre-verbal memories, or do you mean just simply
No,
because they're behind a folder that you don't have
right.
access to?
Things, that's exactly right. The button was turned off, let's just say intentionally, never to be turned back on, because maybe what's behind that button is something that I couldn't handle.
And I used to see that all the time as well. Those buttons that were turned off. And yes, intentionally, sometimes just not having the capacity to even process some of those things and some of those buttons that have been pivotal moments in their lives, and leaving them feeling stuck and misunderstood and not being able to process that in a way that is healthy for them. Again, because look at what they go through from home to placement to this, and there is a sense of having to have that safety. And of course, Joe, going through your life and those buttons that were turned off, you were in survival mode. And those buttons sometimes automatically come back on when we least expect it. So
This has certainly been intense and in a good way, for me at least, to be able to talk about some of this stuff that I think is just the human condition, right? I hope that people that even don't have a connection to foster care can sort of relate to these human feelings and understand that just because somebody's in foster care doesn't make them so much different than you are, and that we share a common sense of humanity and reactions to the world that we've inherited.
this is what happens. This is what happens. It does. It just brings up so much. And we could spend hours talking about all of this, the trauma, the broken system, the stigma, and how it's all combined and just put all together. And I think the biggest thing that we can do as humans is to do this and to teach and to educate and just to talk about what people have such a hard time talking about and the reality of what it looks like, the system and the broken system and the youth that are in it.
I guess for me, this we're talking about it in the context of foster care, and I clearly understand why, but I think of Renee, you shared working in a residential and that cabin being the worst of the worst, which is basically like they're the least palatable for society. That's really what it is that you are the least palatable for society. So the piece that I think has nothing to do with foster care is that why, as a society, do we find this unpalatable? Why do we, as a society, find these big feelings and big emotions that happen to come out in these youth in foster care? But it's also people who are incarcerated, people who use drugs, people who are marginalized, who express any sort of big feeling, happiness, sadness, joy, all of these things are somehow less palatable. So we push them to the fringes.
Well,
And I think foster care is just one of those ways that we do that.
the more things change, the more they stay the same. This is not any different than sort of the history that I laid out in the beginning. We may be able to talk a little bit more about it, but we still, as a society, I think react to these situations the same way. It's like out of sight, out of mind. I don't want to see them. I don't want to hear them. Let the homeless go live some. I believe in doing things for the homeless, but don't let them be on my front lawn, right? I mean, those are,
Mhm.
if I don't have to see it, then I can absolutely deal with it and it'd be fine.
Well, I mean, people with disabilities, intellectual disabilities in particular, I mean, I have a kid who does things differently and looks like she wouldn't, and then does, and shows big emotion and doesn't filter that for anyone. And something can be triggering and nobody understands why, and myself included. And it can be really tricky, even as a parent, to be like, right, just because I don't understand it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means I don't understand it. That's all. There's a very simple explanation. I don't understand it. Now, what I do with that, do I allow for connection here, or do I try to shut it down because it doesn't look right for the general public? And I can't tell you the amount of times that there's been a behavior that I've been given side eye or directly been told, like, well, if that was my child, I would already have popped her. Danielle, you are right. How are we not able
Still.
Yeah, and like you, Martha, I have a child that like sometimes will go places and her behavior, it makes perfect sense to her. I know that to be true, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's hard to decipher why it played out that way. And that's not acceptable here. Well, why not? Well, why? Because it makes you uncomfortable, because you don't understand it, because you can't control it. And that's, I think, what's so sad for me is that, and then once we can label it, right? So once we can put a label of like, oh, it's a foster kid, or oh, they're mentally ill, or oh, they're this, then somehow we explain it away, and it doesn't really exist anymore because we gave it a label. Right. No, those big feelings still exist. Those concerns still exist, but we've labeled it so it's better now, and that's what I don't understand. And I think through this, like we're talking about foster care, but this so connects to just so many everyone. I mean, it really does. If you're honest with yourself, you have been in situations, I've been in situations where I'm like, oh, this makes me feel really icky. And how do I not feel icky right now? Because this is making, and I feel like I try and not be like that. But the reality is that, I have clients that come see me that I'm like, oh God, please don't sit in my office today. Um, because I'm like, these are things that I just can't, I don't have the capacity to deal with right now, or want to for that matter. But then by design, so many people shut it down rather than figuring out how do I adapt to this?
And again, I'm thinking about your great grandmother, Joe, and I'm thinking about how much she must have been suffering and how much her suffering must have made people uncomfortable, to the extent that they took her and shut her away alone because they couldn't hold it. So they said, you're going to have to hold this all by yourself.
One of the things that I thought that I wasn't going to do is to, mention names, but I'm going to name her. They called her Tessie, and this episode is for Tessie.
For sure.
Absolutely.
I also think about the idea of like her family, that she died alone, and that older generations made decisions for younger generations that you're not going to want to deal with this either, right? We don't have the capacity to give you the skills to deal with Tessie because we don't want to deal with Tessie. So therefore, it became a secret because one generation made decisions for other generations, and it was just easier to keep it a secret than to figure out how to develop the skills to deal with whatever her big feelings were. And by design, Joe, you weren't given the opportunity, if that. I mean, not that generationally you would have been able to, but like it was already decided that you didn't have the capacity to deal with that story well before it got to you.
Or the capacity to be part of that family, period.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
like I wasn't even, that wasn't even a thought, right? It wasn't, we can't do this.
I think that's a great way to end today, is giving your great grandmother a name. And this is in honor of her today. So I want to thank Danielle. I want to thank Martha really for joining us. Conversations are always wonderful, and we appreciate you joining. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank you for
much.
having me.
You
Yeah.
have, yeah, for sure.
And remember, the baggage that we carry throughout our lives becomes a lot lighter when we remember to make space for help.
Thank you to our guests this week, Danielle and Martha, and our editor, Lily Hamilton. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and a review. To stay up to date with Out of the Starting Blocks and Into the Race and get all the behind-scenes content, you can follow us on Instagram at Tornado Tools and on X at Joe Tools. Make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't already and visit our website at joetools.com. Next time on Out of the Starting Blocks and Into the Race.
I think what's striking me the most is I just think this like generational trauma that's gone so back far in your family impacted the three siblings in very different environments, but in a very similar way. And that's I'm just trying to kind of wrap my mind around this idea that like no matter whether you were raised with them or you were removed from them, this generational trauma still very much impacted you all. And the situation didn't necessarily matter because the trauma just perpetuated on both sides.